Okay, we are now live with the September 11th episode of Prehistory A Traveler's Guide. Not that withstanding, of course. I am the showrunner, Greg W. Neneman, and just joining me today is my longtime co-host and Monster Hunter friend, Scott Mardis.
Hello.
And today we are going to be taking a look at the most famous of all cryptids and lake monsters, Nessie, the beast of Loch Ness. And on the docket today we'll be covering one such script featuring a Loch Ness monster that never got released from the same decade as the more well-known Toho Hammer collaboration that I did a special on at G-Fest. The film is called The Sea Dragon of Loch Ness, written by John Sayles. That will be at least one potential topic of discussion today. Scott here will be covering a real-life Loch Ness controversy that may have also influenced this script. So you want to get us started on some of the real-life Loch Ness stuff, Scott?
Well, yeah. One thing I want to say is, at this point in time, I am of the opinion that there has not yet been a decent Nessie fiction film made, in my opinion. Not that they're all completely terrible, but the ones that have been made have been a little too kiddie-ish, you know, aimed at kids, family-oriented, which is okay if that's the kind of films that you like, but we really need a lean and mean Nessie movie with a scary Loch Ness monster. A good one. There have been attempts, but nobody has really managed to do it yet. I have high hopes, possibly, for a movie adaptation of the Steve Alton novel, but we'll see. What is your opinion on this question?
Oh, okay. Now you're certainly not wrong. Nessie has been in a lot of films in all manner of, genres and tones. Some, kitschy, kid stuff, some sentimental, some attempts at horror. But overall, there's some appearances where Nessie did get some good on-screen cred. Like, one of my personal favorite appearances of Nessie is a crossover with Godzilla. In Godzilla the series episode Deadlock. That's a good example of Nessie being portrayed rather well. But in terms of movies,
I don't think I've ever seen that.
It's personally one of my favorite episodes from Godzilla the series, and it was the last time that actor Roddy McDowall had a role in before his passing. He played the scientist in that episode who captured Nessie's baby and was holding it captive for exploitation, causing Nessie to go on a rampage then, until she and Godzilla teamed up to get her kid back.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of Nessie movies that I like, but they're not really up to snuff. Like Beneath Loch Ness is one I like, but it has a lot of cheesy elements, and the effects are kind of
The effects are not the greatest, and Patrick Bergen seems like he's hamming it up for the camera in that film.
Yeah, it is what it is. It's a silly movie. I like it on a silly level. I also like the Loch Ness Horror, but it's a terrible movie.
That one is just Loch Ness Horror. Absolutely. Oh my goodness! Terrible. Oh my goodness! It's garbage.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it as a bad movie connoisseur, but I would like to see a really good Nessie movie. The Water Horse had great special effects, and I like the Nessie design. But the rest of the movie was just too kiddie. It's aimed at kids, and it's just like, I'm not a kid anymore. The effects just couldn't carry the story, for what it was. And the Ted Danson movie has some nice effects in it too, but it's not really a Nessie movie. It's a kiddie romantic movie, so there you go.
Yeah, and this cues the script for what I'm about to talk about today, which really would have been a potential legit good Nessie film. That's the John Sayles Sea Dragon of Loch Ness script, which I'll go to detail here.
You read a screenplay, and you're missing the element of actors filling out these characters. So just reading the screenplay because there's not an actor acting these parts out and giving emotion to the dialogue, it just naturally seems the characters seem kind of cliched. And the reason why is they're not filled out. There's not actors playing them. You're just reading this dialogue in your head, So it probably would have worked really well with fine actors playing the parts,
Yeah, exactly. And I'll get started here with my reading of the chapter from John.
Sure, go ahead.
The chapter is from the book Jaws Unmade: The Lost Sequels, Premakes, Remakes, and Ripoffs, written by my good friend and co-host from G-Fest, John LeMay. All right, John Sayles, Sea Dragon of Loch Ness. Script date: March the 5th, 1979, first revised version. Screenplay: John Sayles. Proposed cast of characters: Bill Guzak, a world-renowned diver; Marcella Yost, shark expert; Kit Guzak, Bill's rebellious teenage daughter; retired adventurer Sir Kevin Mason; and our film's antagonist, Campbell, stereotypical cliche evil oil company owner. Proposed creatures: the titular Nessie, sharks. Synopsis: construction of an illegal underwater pipeline accidentally awakens a giant prehistoric monster. The creature is none other than Loch Ness's own Nessie, who uses an undersea tunnel that connects Loch Ness to the ocean to go back and forth between the two. At the same time, Sir Kevin, a wealthy English naturalist, launches an expedition to find Nessie at the recent sighting of the lake. And Sir Kevin hires one of the world's greatest divers, Bill Guzak, along with Dr. Marcella Yost, who has recently developed a new shark anesthetic in search for Nessie. The investigation, which discovers the undersea tunnel, draws the ire of the evil oil execs, determined to keep the pipeline a secret at all costs. John's commentary. I'll be reading this full chapter to you all. Okay, commentary. Very little is known about this script from Piranha writer John Sayles outside of its contents. Or, he goes on to say, I don't know if any major studio ever considered this scenario. Being a solid, well-written story coming off the recent successes of Jaws 2 and Piranha in 1978, the main reason why the film didn't get made, the author suspects, was that it would have been very expensive. In addition to Nessie herself, this film would have required extensive underwater photography with expensive submarines. And shooting on location at the loch, along with finding an oil derrick, may have also seemed potentially intimidating to would-be investors. And the screenplay was also being developed at the same time of Toho Hammer's long-gestating Nessie was in its final death throes. In fact, in either 77 or 78, 20th Century Fox had gotten in touch with Hammer regarding having their movie being possibly named the same as their own Nessie production, which they had in development. So, was Sea Dragon of Loch Ness the stolen question? Who knows? Considering that Sayles revised the screenplay, this would indicate that somebody was interested in it. And for one last aside, both the Hammer John Sayles script and the Toho Hammer Nessie film both have one thing in common, is that there's an oil rig attack in this. Though it may have went unproduced just like Hammer's Nessie, many fans like John and myself have wondered what Sea Dragon might have been like if it had been made. And, well, from John's observations to the script, he describes Sea Dragon as one of those respectable monster movies that would have been absolutely solid in the storytelling, yet would probably upset some monster fans because not enough monster. The script is just like Jaws in a sense that the creature is not fully revealed until late into the story. In fact, you don't get a full body shot till the ending action scene. Before this, you might see a massive eye, hump, flipper, but never a full creature. But the full-on entrance during the final act sounds quite spectacular. And per verbatim from John Sayles' words, we hear one more cry, then the beast swims out of the shadows, more like an island than a creature, covered with barnacles and scars. It is immense, truly magnificent, and coming right towards us, shrieking with fury, its cry booming off the cavern walls. And as for the explanation for her bigger than normal size, there's a down-to-earth explanation for this, or down-to-earth compared to the one in the Hammer script, which the creature was exposed to Mutane 4, a mutagenetic compound. Sayles goes with the reasoning that reptiles never stop growing. Nessie is very old, henceforth she's very, very large. The human cast of characters are also said to be quite solid, and considering it's they and not the creature who carries the script, this is rather fortunate. Our film's protagonist is the scuba diver Bill Guzak, opposite shark biologist Marcella. Their relationship starts off predictably enough, but still excellent, as they do the usual routine where they kind of have a hard time working together, but are they work together on an item by story's conclusion. Marcel probably gets a bit more development than Guzak, and John thinks an actress like Orca's Charlotte Rampling would have suited her quite well. One of the film's better scenes has Guzak underestimating Marcel's abilities underwater, and as he boasts of his daughter Kit's capabilities, almost breaking world record kid of female divers, Marcel then tells him that it was her world record that Kit failed to beat. And speaking of Guzak's daughter Kit, she just may come off as the script's best character. Potentially may cause annoying for some, she represents a teenage character that's surprisingly well developed for a supporting role in a 1970s monster flick. And providing that odd couplings are always the best, Kit has some touching scenes with the more refined Sir Kevin. Initially, Kit belittles him, thinking he's just an armchair adventurer who's never done anything risky in his life. Sir Kevin chides her by saying, that's not quite true. After all, he survived one of the most trying events of his life. Quote, an afternoon with the world's most obnoxious teenager. And later, after Kit has a close call with Nessie when she dies in the loch, Sir Kevin presents her with a gold medallion. Kit recognizes it as being from a famous shipwreck. She asks Kevin how much he paid for it, thinking he bought it. To her shock, he was actually one of the divers who fetched it. This next set of dialogue from John Sayles is actually rather quite good. Kit, the Santa Veronica dive was years ago. Sir Kevin, so was my youth. Kit looks at him. It was in the worst currents of the Caribbean. Sir Kevin, positive you don't want it? Kit, you risked your neck for this. Can't give it away. Sir Kevin, with a smile. What's our treasures for? As for the similarities to Jaws, there may not actually be as many as you may think. The most notable is a POV shot from the monster's perspective as it watches Kit swim over but does not attack her. And there's also this great scene, a great atmospheric moment where two men are dynamite fishing on the loch on one foggy morning. After several explosions, they hear a mournful roar, not unlike that of a foghorn. Suddenly, a towering black shape drifts toward them in the fog and overtakes their boat before we shift to another scene. Some people think this scene came from the Fisherman Jaws sequence, but John disagrees. And aside from that, there are two notable scenes with sharks in the screenplay. And our first introduction to Marcella is underwater in scuba gear as she's testing her new underwater anesthesia on sharks. And later, Marcella and Guzak must fend off some hungry sharks in an underwater tunnel. And they find one shark that's been bitten in half in the loch. This is their way of telling you that there's something bigger. Nessie being a larger beast in Jules. Okay, now for the oil storyline. The script's oil storyline in some ways forms the backbone of Sea Dragon, and brings to mind Bird-Eye Gordon's Devilfish project, in which oil and juice would also figure prominently into the narrative. Considering these were developed around the same time, one has to think, were great minds simply thinking alike, or if there was more direct connection. And the climax of this story actually bears some similarities to Jaws 3, which Sea Dragon actually predated. The climax comprises of Guzak and Marcel coming into conflict with the oil company's hired thugs whilst underwater. The oil company naturally doesn't want anybody reporting on their illegal pipeline that they found while they were searching for the monster. So from the underwater HQ, they send out a submarine to battle with the sub that Guzak and Marcel are piloting. A tussle occurs between the subs, both have machine arms, which awakens the monster. Nessie comes in and attacks the enemy sub, which had remotely detonated an underwater mine. As she's destroyed the sub, Nessie then attacks the underwater observation deck, coming straight at the glass just like in Jaws 2D, but instead of just breaking the glass, another passage from the script coming right up. The beast pushes the habitat completely over. It crashes on its side, seems cracking and gas busting out. The last lights in the cavern are going out with a huge flash and roar. We stay in the darkness for a moment, then hear the cry of the beast once again. Sayles' script is good about having the cake and eating it too. From what I've been mentioning here, it seems that Sayles wanted Nessie to be both a sympathetic figure, but also be a sort of antagonist to the film's heroes at the end of the story. Nessie is established as being sympathetic in that she does not attack Kit when she's out swimming midway of the script. And she only attacks when the oil company sub explodes on him. But then she naturally views the submarine as a threat. And Guzak's submarine becomes guilty by association, allowing her to chase after her heroes after she's disposed of the villains. She chases them further into the ocean and grabs the sub in her jaws. Marcel uses some helium jets to blast them free of the beast and then discharges a dye tech to obscure them from the beast's view. When that's not enough, she uses a massive dose of a shark tranquilizer to subdue the creature. However, in the struggle, Nessie has managed to damage their engines, so they're stuck. So their only hope is to be rescued. which Kit Sir Kevin orchestrated over radio. The Navy dispatches a specially trained SEAL to swim down a tow line to the sub. Nessie is once again awakened, and she's keeping an eye on things. She does not harm the poor SEAL, but when she sees the sub being towed to the surface, she grips in her jaws again, knowing they have no other options. Guzak and Marcellus swim to the surface on their own, while the monster remains distracted by the sub. And the duo make their way to a Navy ship where Sir Kevin and Kit are watching. The joystick reunite, and then Nessie breaks the surface. She roars and like a whale that's leapt into the air, dives back under the waters in front of her awed spectators. And following this is one final scene, an epilogue set within a pub at Loch Ness. The pub, along with a local drunkard, Old Man Macduff, had been a recurring element throughout the script, with Macduff a knowing old-timer who had seen the monster several times. As they enter the pub, revels in the news that Nessie has been finally proven to exist. Macduff looks sad and walks outside. He stands and shows her the look. Macduff, they'll be at you like pack-ants now, with the ships and plane and fancy equipment. But you'll outweigh them all, won't you, like the ones before? And you'll come back, you will. You all come back to Loch Ness. We pull back slowly, keeping moving back till Macduff is a tiny silhouette against the moonlit, eerie Loch Ness. This concluding the chapter on Sea Dragon on Loch Ness from John LeMay's book.
Well, now, reading the actual screenplay, I got the impression that Nessie was supposed to be bioelectric and could generate an electrical field like an electric eel. And I'm surprised he doesn't mention that in that chapter. But that's what I read in the actual screenplay. So maybe I misunderstood something. I don't know, but that's what I read.
I'll definitely have to take a look at the full script myself to see where it's alluded to.
And he doesn't implicitly say anywhere in the screenplay that it's a plesiosaur, but it's implied. There's a section where the marine biologist is talking about the coelacanth. Then she mentions the possibility of large marine reptiles surviving. So that's the only real implication that I saw in the screenplay, that Nessie was implied to be a reptile, probably a plesiosaur. So I don't know. But I'm going from the actual screenplay that I read yesterday.
And so now that you know more of the behind the scenes behind Sea Dragon, what are your thoughts on it overall, Scott?
Well, like I said, fleshed out with actors and the visual element, it would probably make a very good movie. But when you read a screenplay and you don't have the actors acting it out, the characters sometimes can seem kind of cliched, And I was familiar with the whole oil rig idea because that's been used in several Nessie stories. I believe it's in Beneath Loch Ness, and it's in Jeffrey Convitt's Nessie book. It's in another Nessie book that I like a lot called Between the Devil and the Deep. So it's a recurring theme, the fact that Loch Ness sits in a geologic fault, and it's suspected that there might be oil underneath that fault or around that fault, and it's very close to the North Sea, which has all sorts of oil rigs anyway, drilling oil in the North Sea. So it's a very natural idea to bring into a story about Loch Ness if you're wanting to fill it out with other things other than just monster sightings. It makes sense,
So while we're on that subject, how about we start off on a discussion about Jeffrey Convitt's book?
Well, it's simply called Monster. And I'm trying to remember, he wrote a very famous horror novel before this. Maybe The Sentinel, I think?
Yeah, it says right here on the cover of Monster, spellbinding new through by the author of The Sentinel. So that's the thing he's probably the most well known for.
So that was a very popular horror book and wound up being a very popular horror movie as well in 1977. So this was his follow-up. And to really understand why there was such a explosion of Nessie themed products in the late 70s, you have to go back and understand that the late 1970s, there was more people inclined to believe that Nessie was real than ever before, even in the scientific community. because this was right on the heels of the famous Robert Rhines underwater photographic and sonar evidence that happened in the early and mid 1970s. And in December of 1975, the evidence was so persuasive that they were actually able to give Nessie a Latin name and propose it was a real species called Monsterbirds rhombopteryx. I'm sure you've heard about this.
I have.
I mean, I'm young. I'm old enough to remember when it was actually happening. So, in the late 1970s, the New York Times sponsored the 1976 expedition by Robert Rhines and his people, who were mainly associated with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Underwater photographic experts, sonar experts with very heavyweight reputations. Unfortunately, the 1976 expedition did not come back with any new photographs and only a few interesting sonar contacts. So it was a real disappointment. And somewhere around, say, the early 80s, the tide began to turn toward a more negative view of the probability of Nessie existing. But in the late 1970s, belief in Nessie was higher, even in the scientific community, than it had ever been before. So obviously, people that were looking to make entertainment were looking around for interesting subjects to make films about from real life, and interest in Nessie was particularly high at that point in time. So that, in my opinion, can explain the existence of this screenplay and why Toho was trying to make a Nessie movie, and all these books, and the Jeffrey Convitz book. And I have three favorite Nessie fiction books, and that is Steve Alton's book, the book I mentioned before, Between the Devil and the Deep by J.M. Morgan, and Jeffrey Convitz's book. It's a very well-written book, and the monster in Convitz's book is a mutated plesiosaur. And one thing that it has in common with the Sayles screenplay is that there's an underwater tunnel that nobody knows about connecting the sea to Loch Ness, which there has been real-life speculation about that before, but there's no evidence to suggest that it really exists.
Yeah, the whole concept of an underwater passage connecting the loch to the sea has been featured in all manner of Loch Ness media, and it's mentioned in Godzilla the series that Nessie only comes to the loch, as part of her spawning cycle over the centuries.
Yeah. Well, it's a good crutch to use in a fictional story, but the reality of Loch Ness does not really accommodate it, because if you had a tunnel like that, every time the tide went in and out, you would notice tidal movements in Loch Ness, very noticeable ones, and now you don't have that. And there would also be an element of salt water in the loch itself, brackish water, and there's no evidence of salinity in there. So that pretty much rules out the idea in reality.
Naturally. As mentioned...
However, this is important. There is geologic evidence in the form of marine invertebrate fossils that were found in Loch Ness in a layer of clay in 2001 that suggests that sometime between 10,000 years ago and 14,000 years ago, there was a marine invasion of Loch Ness, and it became an arm of the sea, similar to what happened to prehistoric Lake Champlain around the same time period. So therefore, there is the possibility that some kind of marine animals could have come into Loch Ness during that period and got trapped, and if they've managed to breed and survive, they could be living in Loch Ness right now, in theory.
Yeah, in theory. Probably not marine reptiles, though. Probably more likely what Steve Alton went with his story.
If something came in from the sea, from Loch Ness, whatever pedigree it had out in the ocean could go back millions of years. We don't know. in order for there to be plesiosaurs living in Loch Ness now, they would have had to have been plesiosaurs living for millions and millions of years beyond their presumed extinction in the ocean. That goes without saying, you know.
Yeah, naturally. What about, if we're talking about Loch Ness, what are your all thoughts about that recent DNA, technology that they implemented in Loch Ness? And it said it seemingly came up with lots of, traces of eel DNA.
Yeah, well, there are flaws with the study, and the scientists who did the study admit this. They're hoping to go back and tweak their sampling techniques and do better. But anyway, it's a step in the right direction. The biggest red flag about the study is the fact that they found no otter DNA, and they know otters live in Loch Ness. So there's one animal that is known to be in Loch Ness for which they had no DNA samples come up, no sequences. And another oddball one is seals. We know that seals get into Loch Ness on a regular basis. So theoretically, there should have been some seal environmental DNA too, and there wasn't. So obviously, this opens up the possibility that there could be things living in Loch Ness that they weren't able to get DNA samples for one reason or another. We just don't know yet. But there was 20 to 25% of the DNA that they recovered that was unusable or unidentifiable. And the general explanation is that these were fragments that were so fragmentary they weren't able to construct a complete DNA strand from, or were just too contaminated to do anything with. But, it's not 100% sure, so this possibly could be something. Maybe part of it could be from an unknown animal that they just haven't identified yet. I don't know. There is a scientific paper that is in the referee process. I don't know when it's going to be published, but with all this virus stuff going on, there's a lot of papers and journals that are running behind, so maybe that's the reason it hasn't appeared yet. But it is supposedly in the referee process. So I would suggest to everyone, withhold judgment until you read the scientific data in a formal referee paper, So they found absolutely no reptilian DNA in their samples, which would seem to rule out any kind of reptilian creature, at least a resident population of them living in Loch Ness. That doesn't mean that something couldn't come and go from the sea occasionally of a reptilian nature, and we just don't know about it. They found no Wels catfish environmental DNA, no sturgeon environmental DNA. They found amphibian DNA of known amphibians, salamanders and newts and toads, but nothing unusual. There's been a lot of speculation that Nessie could be some kind of large amphibian we don't know about. But they did find an unusual amount of eel DNA, and there's been speculation ever since the 1930s that Nessie might be some kind of giant eel. So that, based on the large amount of eel DNA, they didn't say that Nessie was a giant eel. They said they could not rule out the possibility that unusually large eels exist in Loch Ness and could be responsible for the monster sightings, which is a sensible answer.
And that's what Steve Alt went with for in his story, a giant eel species that got trapped within the loch and then over time grew to gigantic sizes.
Yeah, well, my take on this, I take sort of a middle road. The normal eels, European eels, freshwater eels that live in Loch Ness, normally don't get any larger than 4 or 5 feet long. Now, there is a marine eel called a conger eel that lives in the Moray Firth and the salt waters around Loch Ness. If one of those could adapt to fresh water and survive, that would make the perfect candidate, because these eels can get 10 feet long and is big around as a telephone pole. So it's not a huge leap to go from an eel that is known to get 10 feet long to say there could be an occasional freak that could get 12 feet long or 15 feet long. That would make a respectable Nessie, in my opinion. The only hump there is getting over the freshwater conditions. I don't know. It's certainly not completely impossible.
And that's the explanation I'm most likely inclined to believe is the most plausible for Nessie, is some sort of giant eel creature, maybe a new species, perhaps.
Yeah. So basically, looking at the whole Nessie controversy, almost in the year 2021, we've got two conflicting views. We've got one group of people that say that there's an interesting body of circumstantial evidence to suggest there is something unusual going on in Loch Ness. Then there is another viewpoint that the whole Nessie thing began as a stunt in the 1930s by different people, a hotel owner, and a guy who was also a combination news reporter and the water bailiff of Loch Ness, which was like basically a conservation officer, conspired together to create a story about monster sightings in Loch Ness. And then the whole thing snowballed and has been propelled by mass hallucination for the last almost 90 years. And that different people have contributed to it over time. Some people have made honest mistakes. Some people have pulled deliberate hoaxes. And some people have deluded themselves into reading more into ambiguous evidence that has better explanations as being ordinary objects misperceived. So it depends on what your point of view is, what you're prepared to believe. Personally, I think that a lot of the evidence that is amassed over the last 90 years that a lot of people have claimed to have debunked, I don't personally find debunked. You know, it's very healthy and normal to suggest alternate explanations other than monsters. But then to turn around and insist that that's the only possible interpretation, there's where I have problems with, if you follow me.
Yeah, I'm following you. Yeah.
So, you know, my approach to this is I try to look at all sides of the arguments. And I think the fact that Nessie and belief in Nessie up to this point has persisted over 90 years, I find it hard to believe that this is just mass hysteria. And you look at things like Tim Dinsdale's film from 1960, which some people insist is a boat. I don't think it is, and a lot of other people that have looked at it don't think it is. And then you have the Rhines underwater evidence. You have the flipper photos, which of course are controversial, and because they've been subjected to different types of computer enhancement techniques, some of which are used by NASA at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to enhance pictures from space under normal circumstances. You know, a lot of people have said, well, those are fake, made on a computer. You know, I don't agree with that assessment. And then you have the famous picture from 1975 of what looks like the front end of a plesiosaur. You know the picture I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
The underwater picture with a long neck and the bulbous body and what appear to be two stumpy flippers.
And the head.
That's never really been debunked either. And there's sonar evidence that was gathered by Adrian Shine in 1987 on Operation Deep Scan of some kind of large moving objects that even he can't explain away. So what I'm saying to you is don't throw the baby away with the bathwater. There could be something there. There's enough of a question to keep looking. in my opinion. But I can understand, as meager as the evidence is, why some people would reject it. And I can respect that point of view, and I'm hoping that they can respect mine too.
Yeah, I definitely see I can see kind of both sides of this argument. But if we want to switch, to doing a recap on the Nessie film I covered last year at G-Fest, my friend John also has a chapter on this book which summarizes all the information on it. So I'm going to be doing another reading here.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, here, folks, I'm going to be doing a recap of my panel, Nessie, the Kaiju the Hammer Locked Away, from the chapter from John's book. Loch Ness, Monster on the Loose, Nessie. Development cycle, 1975-1979. Intended release dates, summer of 77, December 78, and then summer of 1980. Screenplay by Michael Carraris and Yuan Lloyd. Story. Treatment by John Starr. First draft by Christopher Wicking, and then Brian Forbes, third draft. Producers, Michael Carraris, Ewan Lloyd, David Frost, yes, the David Frost of Frost-Nixon fame, Tom Sachs, and Toho producer Tomoyuki Tanaka. Proposed directors, Mike Hodges, Brian Forbes, Lindsay Anderson, Andrew V. McLaughlin, Michael Anderson. Proposed director of special effects, Teruyoshi Nakano. And proposed cast. Who's who of big-name actors in that time period. Roger Moore, Candice Bergen, Charlton Heston, Julie Christie, Richard Harris, Catherine Ross, Michael Caine, Shirley Lansing, Gregory Peck, Jean-Paul Belmondo, Ryan O'Neill, Richard Burton, Burt Lancaster, Michael York, Cliff Robertson, Richard Chamberlain, Michael Douglas, Ian Ogilvy, Ando, a Japanese child actor, Rosalind Lloyd, and Michael Billington. Proposed monsters: Nessie, a giant shark, and a monster dog. For the synopsis, a truck carrying a dangerous chemical compound called Mutane-4 loses a barrel of said compound in Loch Ness. The canister mutates Nessie, which causes her to grow to kaiju size and escape the loch. Then a series of disasters occur at sea as Nessie commences a worldwide tour of destruction as she follows an ancestral trail leading to a plesiosaur breeding ground in the South Pacific. Now, for the commentary on this project. When Jaws was dropped in the summer of 75, it did irrevocable damage to the B-movie monsters of the good old days. And not even coincidentally, before Jaws' release, March of 75 was the year that Toho released their final Godzilla film for that time, Terror of Mechagodzilla. We wouldn't see another Godzilla film until 1984's The Return of Godzilla, when the series was rebooted with an aim towards the realism of films like Jaws. And around the same time that Toho's flagship series of monster movies were losing steam, Hammer's Frankenstein and Dracula films were already dead. 74 had seen the last of their gothic horror film, The Seven Brothers Meet Dracula. The film did not even have Christopher Lee in it, and was a kung fu-themed co-production with the Shaw Brothers. In the story, Professor Van Helsing, portrayed by Peter Cushing, went to China to fight a vampire cult led by Count Dracula, who grew tired of Transylvania and went to Chongqing. The film was not a failure, but was not a hit either. Both studios, Hammer and Toho, saw the tides of cinema were fast changing, and it was during this time that the two formed a rather unlikely alliance. It started with Hammer's producer Michael Carraris, who had envisioned a Nessie monster movie film since 1970. However, studio heads were still obsessed with making Dracula and Frankenstein films, and though they found success with Rare Harryhausen's 1 Million Years BC in 1966 and Jim Danforth's When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth in 1970, stop-motion animation was too time-consuming as far as Hammer was concerned. And note the 4-year time skip between Ray Harryhausen's film and Danforth's movie. And seeing that Dracula was legit staked, and that Jaws was very much terrorizing the box office, Carraris felt that now was the prime time to press ahead with his Nessie concept. And this would not be a B-movie. Carraris found an unlikely investor in the form of David Frost, the same journalist who interviewed Richard Nixon, and his Paradigm Productions. To be more thorough, Frost actually had his own Loch Ness monster movie type in the works that he called Carnivore, and so he agreed to him with Hammer. They initially considered stop motion. Carraris immediately began to think about another company that could handle the effects work. Remembering Toho in Japan, who frequently brought reptilian dinosaur monsters like Godzilla and friends to life, he met with the Toho's then CEO, Kukumaru Okuda in 1975. This early meeting then makes Jessie the first unproduced Jaws ripoff that author was aware of, at least. A press conference announcing the production was held on board the ship Hispaniola along the Thames on London's Victoria Embankment. By Easter of next year, Nessie may have traveled here as well, Frost announced at the conference. Then at the same event, Carreras announced that Toho Studios in Japan would be bringing Nessie to life, whom he called, quote, the finest experts in the world. He also said that Toho was building a quarter-scale, $500,000 model of the monster based off of, quote, existing evidence. Consulting on this project was famed British naturalist and Nessie expert Sir Peter Scott, who Carreras went so far as to say was designing the Toho monster. Carreras' remarks were more or less bullshit. There were several artists at Toho who actually designed the creature, and not Sir Peter Scott. The film's proposed director, Brian Forbes, took a potshot at Jaws this time while saying, quote, our film will make Jaws look like a toothpaste commercial. And there were two scenes in Nessie that explicitly reference Jaws. In the first, the movie Jaws is playing on a television set in a lecture yacht that Nessie sinks in the Canary Islands. Two rich scuba divers are frolicking in the depths when they come across the monster. The storyboards for this scene are frightening and depict one of the divers caught in Nessie's jaws as the beast rises its head out of the water. And then there's a scene in which a shark as big as the one from Jaws comes to the contact of Nessie and swims away in terror. To go more depth into the story, Nessie starts off as a 40-foot Elasmosaurus living in the loch, which became mutated and enlarged to 200 feet, or about 60 meters, thanks to the radioactive chemical compound Mutane-4. The plot begins with a truck from the Department of Defense Nuclear Research Institute in Scotland, traveling up a winding road near the loch. Due to carelessness, a chemical barrel containing the mutagenic compound Mutane-4 tumbles into the loch. At the lake at this time is a TV news crew from America led by the arrogant Mark Stafford, potentially played by Roger Moore, trying to do a story on the legend of Loch Ness. Also, there are serious researchers, Dr. Wright, whom Gregory Peck was eyed for, and his colleague Suzanne, prospectively Candice Bergen, reportedly one of the few sympathetic characters. Also lurking is a character by the name of Comfort, a scientist-turned-company man. Eventually he turns into an antagonist out to kill Nessie on behalf of the U.S. and British governments. On a one stormy night, a cabin is crushed by a huge creature that has crawled out of the loch, and soon to follow, a series of disasters begin happening at the sea. A monster attack on an oil rig in the north seas of Britain. Hovercraft sinks the English Channel. Susan and Mark connect the dots between the creature that left the loch and the current disasters and deduct that it is indeed Nessie, the Loch Ness monster. And they do some research on the chemical Mutane-4, and they discover that it acts like a steroid. A dog exposed to Mutane-4 in testing doubled in size and became violent. Now Susan is aware that Nessie is not only growing to Godzilla size, but is now unnaturally violent. So Mark and Susan go to ask a famous marine explorer / hunter, Channon, for help in tracking the creature, and he agrees. And it seems that they had Richard Harris planned to play the part. And this would have been Nessie's equivalent of the Quint character from Jaws. And now having grown to 200 feet, Nessie then sinks a U.S. nuclear submarine near Cape Town, South Africa. Susan then pitches an idea to try to capture the monster in the Sunda Strait with electric stimulus. And then shooting the beast with a massive tranquilizer, then throwing a huge net on it. At this point, Channon, the previously mentioned shark hunter, said wants to now kill the creature instead of capturing her. And as the plan goes forth, a tuna net then decapitates Channon. The plan fails, and Nessie continues on her way, swimming through some underwater ruins, with an ancient painting present in the ruins of an underwater city, reinforcing her nature as a rare mystical beast. The script notes that the music was to be underlined with tragedy here, and from this point forward, the audience sympathy was to be directed towards Nessie a la King Kong. The creature is, of course, on course for Hong Kong, and Comfort and the military are determined to stop her from making landfall. An attack is launched on Nessie by the military, and this includes frogmen in Hong Kong. In the scuffle, an oil tanker is damaged, causing a huge oil spill. The U.S. Air Force takes note of the spill. Storyboards show jet fighters in the sky and lights it on fire. The spill becomes inflamed, and as Nessie tragically burns alive, Mark begins a live broadcast where he and Susan would chastise the U.S. and British governments and expose the cover-up of the Mutane-4. Making this story a globe-trotting affair was supposedly an idea of Toho's. Allegedly, an early script draft kept the story confined to Scotland, and they suggested Nessie should cause chaos across the world's oceans. And the ending, which Nessie burned to death, was also meant to emulate the tragedy of Toho's 1956 entry, Rodan. In that film, of course, the story of the mutated pair of monster pterosaurs approaching Fukushima and then being burned to death in a man-made volcanic eruption. The final shot of Nessie was to have an egg hatching in the loch. The idea of a special effects director Terushi Nakano-san. And this may have also come from some of Toho's higher-ups. And part of the deal with Hammer was that Toho would have international rights to their iteration of the Nessie character. Meaning they could produce a sequel independent of Hammer if they so wished. Nessie versus Godzilla, anybody? Toho had since given up on Godzilla for disaster flicks called panic films in Japan, and it found huge success in the form of The Submersion of Japan in 1973, which got a theatrical release in the US in 1975 as Tidal Wave. Though critics like Ebert found the film guilty by association with the child-friendly Showa Godzilla films, Submersion of Japan was a skillfully crafted disaster flick that was quite a bit, just about as good as the American disaster films at the time, which it predated. And around the time that negotiations on Nessie had begun, Toho had finished another disaster flick at the time called Conflagration. In that film, terrorists hijack an oil tanker and demand that Tokyo blow up their own Kitayama oil fields. And if they refuse, the terrorists would ram the tanker to oil fields themselves. To dupe the terrorists, special effects techs are hired to create a miniature oil field set and blow them up during a live broadcast meant to fool the terrorists. Brian Forbes had saw the sequence and thought it was brilliant. He then sent to Columbia, currently a major backer in the production, as an example of Nakano-san's work. Columbia was not impressed, but they were also not aware of the context of the scene they were watching. Unbeknownst to them, Nakano had intentionally made some of the miniatures look fake, as they were meant to represent a fake effects scene in a movie. How meta is that? In addition to Columbia's lack of faith in the efforts, there were also problems with the scripting department. And this is when we start running into why this film died. It's kind of a sad story. Forbes, who had directed The Slipper and the Rose for Paradigm in 1976, had been brought in to rework the screenplay originally written by Christopher Wicking. He did so under the stipulation that he'd be allowed to also direct. For $10,000 a week for the next month, 4 weeks, Forbes revised the story through 3 drafts. Forbes finished work on the 10th of August, 1976, and then Michael Carreras took back the screenplay and secretly reintegrated ideas he fancied with Wicking's version that Forbes had removed. Forbes was naturally not happy to find out that his script had been revised to a 135 page, which was credited to him and expressed to Carreras in the letter. Mainly, Forbes was irritated by dull characterization of the leads, as well as having too many disaster movie cliches. Forbes also hated the more commercial side of the project. According to some sources, Forbes then left the project after this. It was tentatively to be replaced by Orca director Michael Anderson. And then, of course, the thing that kills a lot of unmade projects, budget. Initially, this budget was set for $4 million US, but eventually swelled to $7 million US. In the book A History of Horrors, The Rise and Fall of the House of Hammer, author Tom Sachs is quoted saying, quote, Paradigm had a lot of clout, and they managed to come up with a bit of cash to get things moving. The problem was that the script wasn't quite good enough to raise the rest of the funds, and all sorts of people had a hand in writing it. And Toho, whose job was to storyboard and provide the effects work, were naturally also getting frustrated with the ever-changing screenplay. Reportedly, the studio had also constructed a $500,000 scale head prop of Nessie. However, this is unlikely untrue. If Toho had made such a pricey prop, photos of it likely would have surfaced by now. And Toho also would have likely found a way to use the prop in another production to recoup their investment. What is known is that Toho did in fact construct a Nessie maquette, and photos do exist of this model, and they're dated to July 20th of 1976. And at one point, they were planning to start shooting in 76 of October and finish by 77 of January. And the film would hopefully be out by the time of summer 77. And then, of course, came the negative critical reception to Dino De Laurentiis' King Kong remake, released in December of 76. And this gave some of the financial backers cold feet, which further delayed production back to the start of May of 77. Then David Bagelman, the head of Columbia, was, suspended under the charge of financial malpractice. And then Columbia dumped the Nessie project. So Carreras and the gang had to seek financing elsewhere. And adding to their own troubles, 20th Century Fox balked at Hammer's current title, The Loch Ness Monster, claiming they had a film in production with that same name. In all likelihood, Fox was too trying to jump on the Jaws bandwagon to produce another aquatic horror thriller. And of course, naturally, Toho was getting tired of this constant stop-and-go game, and so withdrew themselves from the project. In an act of desperation, Hammer's producer Tom Sachs cut the script down to 120 pages with fewer action and effect scenes, with a film now retitled Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, to include possibilities for marketing tie-ins. The tweaking of the script didn't stop there, no, siree. And further contributing to different draft versions were Scott Finch, Mort Fine, and Gerald D. Pago from late 1977 into early 78. Not helping matters was the fact that Anderson was poised to direct, with Orca star Richard Harris as one of the lead roles. As Orca wasn't a big hit at the time, there was a fear that reteaming the men for Nessie would be another strike on the film. And by March of that same year, 78, the project was dead in the water when David Frost could see no light at the end of Toho, unquote, for the film. Then now budgeted at $10 million US bucks, and liquidated Paradigm Productions Limited. Carreras and Lloyd were removed from the Hammer board in late April of 1979. Yet the duo still seemed to try and find investors for their film, now simply just called Nessie. So things seem to be looking up for the production as Carreras made efforts to book the Pinewood 007 stage, and he secured Catherine Ross as a lead of a co-producing sponsor form of Robert Stigwood. It was all too little too late though. Stigwood visualized interest, and this time Nestle had finally sank for good. Though Nessie might have been a moderate hit, it was not going to likely eclipse Jaws as the producers touted. Furthermore, the prospective pot shots of the film took at Jaws would have probably proved embarrassing in hindsight. Now, on one final note, Nessie did see the light of day in a roundabout way. In 1987, Toho's proposed effects director Teruyoshi Nakano-san was poised for retirement. His last movie was to be an adaptation of the Japanese folktale, The Bamboo Cutter Story. The film adaptation was called Princess from the Moon, and called for a scene featuring a dragon attacking a sailing ship at sea. Nakano decided to dig up his old Nessie design from 10 years ago, not out of laziness. He simply wanted to see the monster realized. And so the dragon looks precisely like an Allosaurus with humps on his back. In fact, if one compares the dragon from that film with the Nessie we kept in the 70s, this confirms that the Princess from the Moon does indeed use that Nessie design from old. So that thus concludes my recapping of Nessie, the story that never was.
Okay, I must point out, there has to be a connection between this movie and the Legend of Dinosaurs and Monsterbirds. I would think that, what was it, Toei or Dai, whoever made the Legend of Dinosaurs.
That was a Toei production.
Must have heard something about this and said, okay, we'll make our own Nessie movie.
The Legend of Dinosaurs and the Monsterbirds was a Toei production. And so this was this was just another
Nessie movie with a pterodactyl in it too, you know.
And there's actually a write-up about this movie in John's book, actually, too. Yeah, there's a thing, if you guys would like, I could go over the development of this movie, actually.
Sure, absolutely.
Yep, this book doesn't just cover the movies that were unmade. This also covers films that actually got made and ended up being released.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun. Kind of a lot of fun doing these.
Yeah.
Okay, here. So, next chapter. Developing Legend of Dinosaurs. Released on April 29th, 1977. Alternate titles, The Legend of Dinosaurs and Monsterbirds. Legend of Dinosaurs, Giants of the Past, The Monsters of Prehistory, Magnitude 10 Earthquake, and Legend of Dinosaurs. This was directed by Junji Kurata. Effects by Fuminori Obayashi. Screenplay by Isao Matsumoto and Ichiro Otsu. Music by Masao Yagi. Cast: Sunihiko Watase, Ashiwaza, Nobiko Sawa as Akiko, Tomoko Kiyoshima, Junko, Shotako Hayasha as Akira, and Fukushi Maki as Moko. And of course, the synopsis, well, of course, this one is pretty well known to monster movie buffs, and this is one of John's favorite movies. But I'll do a recap of the synopsis. I'll go through the synopsis here, just for anyone who hasn't seen the movie. An ice cave full of prehistoric eggs was rumored to lie beneath the forest of Mount Fuji, which brings geologist Ashizawa to the scene. During the investigation, Ashizawa meets an old flame of his, Akiko, a photographer scuba diving in Lake Sai, with her friend Junko. It becomes apparent that something is lurking in those waters because several mysterious deaths begin to occur, including the death of Junko. Soon, the lake is besieged by scientific equipment and investigators who have no finding a monster, alleged to be a plesiosaurus. In the ice caves, one of the eggs hatches a giant Rhamphorhynchus, which kills 2 spelunkers. With no luck finding the monster, they travel an underwater passage into an ice cave where they find the broken egg and the gruesome remains of 2 victims. Back at the surface, the newly hatched pterosaur kills several of the town's populace and then returns to the forest. Miraculously outside the cave, Ashizo and Akiko are shocked to see the plesiosaur on land in the woods, and soon a battle ensues between the marine reptile and the pterosaur as Mount Fuji then begins to erupt. Both monsters are killed when they fall into a fissure caused by the massive eruption. The fates of our 2 leads are unclear, though they're at least together. Alright, now for the commentary from John LeMay. Do you ever wonder what the Japanese reaction to Jaws was? As much as Japan loved giant monster movies, Kaiju-eiga, surely they have a response? Well, they did, and many consider this to be one of the worst monster movies ever made. Treated as the highest budget Japanese monster movie ever by powerhouse Toho Studios. Legend of the Dinosaurs and Monsterbirds was a flop when it was released in Japan. The roots of the project are many faceted, but reach not back to only to Jaws, but also to the King Kong remake from Dino De Laurentiis. Toho Studios were renowned in Japan for their Yakuza films and let Daiei and Toho churn out their giant monster flicks. But with the hype generated by the Japanese release of Jaws and the impending remake of King Kong, Toho finally wanted in on the giant monster game. Rather than copying Jaws, they tried to first ape Kong. Pun intended. To do this, they teamed up with Amicus Productions of England, the same company behind Line That Time Forgot, I believe?
Yes.
So when Amicus went belly up, they turned attention to get a giant devil ray from outer space and Devil Manta. When they could find nobody to back them on that, they decided to do an aquatic creature flick like Jaws. Instead of sharks, they wanted to use dinosaurs. The idea was that of Toei president Shigeru Okada, who specifically wanted to do a movie similar to Jaws so they could hopefully export to other territories. The initial story draft was much closer to Jaws than the resultant film, set in an inland lake. The story pitch was set on Kisogashima Island and the Satsunan Islands, where non-specified aquatic dinosaurs to munch on beachgoers. Identifying Archaeopteryx, a rather ludicrous idea, considering these prehistoric birds reptiles were not that large to begin with. And possibly for cutting the budget's sake, the location the story was in shifted to Lake Sai, the body of water located at the foot of Mount Fuji. Now, despite this being set in the lake, the film still has more than its share of callbacks to Jaws. As seen in the film, the plesiosaur kills several people before we actually see the creature. First, a couple on the paddle boat are capsized by an unknown object. Secondly, a headless horse is found in the woods, in the trees. Like, how the heck did they get up there? And before we get a full-on reveal of the creature, we are teased in the form of a hoax. No doubt audiences remember the scene in Jaws where there's 2 boys staging a prank of a shark and right before the real shark shows up. This also happens here, too. Shark fin and all. Even though the Lake Sai monster is known to the locals as a dragon or dinosaur, not a shark. And there's also the country music festival happening on the lake as well. And 2 scuba divers operate a large black shark fin in the distance. And their friend on shore makes sure to point out to everybody. Panic ensues for a while until the female lead, a photographer, uses a zoom lens to confirm that this is all fake. And as our prankster butt hits when they're sure to meet their buddy at a remote location outside lake, SpaghettiOs, the real monster then rises up from the water and eats them while their friend watches in terror. Then their buddy runs to the government office to tell him that the real monster's disappeared. The mayor just chides him for not doing a better job of the hoax and doesn't believe him at all. Of course, there's got to be one of those type of politicians. And you see, there's just a hint that the local village either paid the boys to perpetuate the hoax or complicit somehow. And as with Jaws, the theme of a village or community in need of tourist money is front and center. Actually, the film is an interesting inverse of Jaws, and that the locals actually are promoting their monster, which I think is mythical as their main tourist draw. Ironically, this is somewhat similar to an idea that was discarded from Howard Sackler's original Jaws 2 story, where a promoter begins exploiting the shark attack. And once the plesiosaur reaches its ugly head for real, people start dying by the wayside. There's a simultaneous fear and rejoicing on the heart of the village people. Now, more people than ever have been drawn to the village, even if no one's allowed to go to the water. And of course, the Legend of Dinosaurs Monsterbirds' most iconic, famous scene of all the plesiosaurs stalking a girl in a raft. Though the effects are not as good as Jaws, the scares generated by the staging are top-notch. Perhaps because this lake is so foggy, so remote, so isolated. The girl is waiting on her friend Akiko, who is scuba diving in the lake's depths. Why the dino doesn't eat her? Pfft, who the hell knows? The girl named Junko innocently dips her feet into the water from the raft and begins to kick them. Out pops the head of the plesiosaur from the depths. It grabs the girl by the foot, lifts her high in the air, and then drops her. The creature is deliberately and cruelly playing with its food. It submerges, watching Junko from a distance as she tries desperately to swim to shore. It surfaces beneath her. Lifting her up on the slimy head, Junko screams and falls back into the water. Curiously, the plesiosaur watches Junko panic and struggle in the water, and we fade out, not actually seeing her get devoured. And then her friend Akiko then comes back to the raft, curious where Junko is gone. Shouting for her, a hand suddenly emerges from the water and grips the raft, still alive. There you are, Akiko says, relieved. She grabs Junko's hand, and in quite the jump scare, the half-eaten torso plops onto the raft. Of course, Junko could not possibly still have to move her arms at this point, but still a good scare no less. And it managed to make this film actually gorier than Jaws. And then there's another interesting thing here that John mentions. Years later on, Richard Matheson would pitch a Jaws sequel, where a great white swims upriver and becomes trapped in the lake. There, it naturally eats the locals who have no idea that a great white shark is in their lake. The spooky raft scene from The Legend of Dinosaurs makes author John LeMay think in some way we missed out on Matheson's treatment in some way. Legend of Dinosaurs raft scene would have worked terrific with a shark from Jaws, stalking its unsuspecting victim in the impenetrable fog. One of the bigger nods to the movie Jaws in Legend of Dinosaurs comes during a village meeting to describe the monsters. You all remember the scene in Jaws where an official draws the shark on the chalkboard. Here they've drawn a plesiosaur on the chalkboard, and Ben Gardner's head gets a nod too, as does the floating leg in the lagoon. As Ashizawa and Akiko scuba dive in the lake, a severed head floats in front of them, predating a similar scare scene from Jaws 3D. But it's more of a shock than scare factor. And soon they find a tunnel they swim up that leads them to the cave where the Ramphorhynch is attached. And Akiko grasps them, that turns out to be, yikes, severed leg! And also predating that similar scene from Jurassic Park where Samuel L. Jackson's dismembered arm was discovered in the shed. And the ending, of course, is nothing like Jaws at all, and goes completely off the rails to deliver the two critter props as they're pitted against each other. It looks a bit like two museum exhibits banging into each other. And to add to the excitement, then Mount Fuji erupts and the lava swallows up the beasts. And as stated earlier, Toho had allegedly pumped a great deal of yen into the film. Doesn't look like it, making it their highest budgeted feature ever. Largely, they did this because they had high hopes that this would be a profitable release overseas, which it turned out not to be. In the US, the most coveted market of all, it was released straight to video. And to add insult to injury, it was picked up by the company currently releasing all of the kid-friendly Gamera films to home video.
Yep.
As such, the film that was actually gory than Jaws was mistakenly put under the company's Just for Kids label. Thanks to this mistaken moniker, I actually saw this film long before I would ever see Jaws. So for me, this was the first one that would make me go afraid in the water. And then here's a note here as well. Shark bites. Terremoto Tengrado. In Italy, The Legend of Dinosaurs was re-edited into more of a disaster film called Magnitude 10 Earthquake. Completely ruined the original score, but plays with music tracks by John Barry from The Deep. Arguably, John Barry's score improved the film, even though the use of that score was quite illegal.
Well, The Legend of Dinosaurs is a great bad movie. Pretty much like the Loch Ness Horror and the Crater Lake Monster. You know, they have some nice scenes. The Crater Lake Monster has really good special effects. But the script is, is a mess. There's a lot of padding in it, but I like it for what it is, If you like bad monster movies or mediocre monster movies, you'll love these movies. But as far as being high cinema, they're not. And I would like to see a really good, scary, reasonable Nessie movie made. But at this point in time, the Alton book seems to be the most promising thing on the horizon. So we'll see. You know.
And that one will have a big budget to go with it, which a lot of these other films just simply did not have.
And I've seen some wonderful concept art that's been made recently, so I could see some of this stuff happening on the screen, especially that piece of concept art where the Nessie is coming across to eat the sheep. I love that picture.
Yeah, artist Tan Nago created some wonderful illustrations of scenes from Steve Alton's Locke novel, and which I hope we'll get to see in the big budget film adaptation when that does
William
come out.
McDonald, my friend, has done some great art for that too.
He also, William McWilliam also wrote a whole extra chapter on the research that went into the writing of Steve Alton's book, which is found in the new expanded editions of the book.
Yep. That was originally published as a separate booklet, I think, back in the 90s, maybe?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
That's when it was originally written, but it wasn't put out until following our interview in 2018.
Yeah.
With Steve Alton.
Yeah. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up, don't you?
I think this is a pretty good place to call it. Honestly, I covered quite a great deal about unmade Nessie projects and whatnot, and got to plug my friend John's book. So
yeah, and I think I did a pretty good summary of the state of the real Nessie controversy, more or less. Anybody that really has followed the story should be able to fill in the gaps, you know?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Well, it's nice to be back. Hopefully we can try to do this once a month or something, you know? And keep it going. How long has it been since we did an episode?
My last episode I recorded was back in January 2019 with paleo artist Danielle Dufault.
Well, there you go. We're way overdue. We're almost a year and a half late, I think.
And also my interview I recorded last week with the developers for that dinosaur game, Goner, which I did on Discord.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're back, huh?
More or less, yes.
And hopefully next time we'll have some more people to sit around and go, ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, I've been looking to bring some new people onto the show and actually collab with, fellow podcasters, like Henry Winston from It Came From a Monster Movie, or some of my other kaiju podcast buddies like Nathan Marchand of the Kaiju Vault, or bring back Kyle Bird, from Kaiju Transmissions, for example. These guys are huge film buffs and all that.
You should have Dinosaur George on again.
I definitely will think about getting in touch with Dinosaur George Blossing one of these days. He's been posting his interviews he's been doing with scientists and whatnot.
All recently, yes.
So I'm happy to see that our friend's keeping himself occupied during these trying times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wish him the best with this illness, too.
So, yeah, I say this is a good place to stop recording. So thanks for coming on today, Scott. It was nice to catch up and talk about the Loch Ness Monster for an hour and a few minutes.
Absolutely. Always game to talk about Nessie.
And anything prehistoric from the sea or freshwater.
Absolutely.
So, and that...
All right. You have a good night.
Yeah, sure, Scott. And this will conclude today's broadcast of Prehistory, A Traveler's Guide.